Hi YouTube, Darth here. This is Yes or No, a weapon review series where I give a clear and concise answer as to what weapons you should be using in Battlefield 4. Today I'm looking at the MTAR-21 Carbine. This carbine is probably one of my lesser used carbines going into this analysis, and I'll talk about why shortly. But what about you? Should you be using the MTAR-21? Yes or no? No, and I really wrestled with this decision today because the weapon is close to being something I can recommend. In a lot of ways, it reminds me of how I felt about the A91 carbine. It has a lot of good features with some pretty serious detractions. But let's talk about what the MTAR is good at. The MTAR is the fastest firing carbine at 900 rounds per minute. It just barely edges out the ACWR by 20 rounds, and depending on the server tick rate, that actually won't make much of a difference between the two weapons. But at close range, those rounds really make the carbine's damage model sting. The MTAR-21 has the second fastest time to kill among carbines, losing only to the Groza. Its minimum time to kill is 269 milliseconds. This makes it one of the fastest killing automatic weapons in the game, but there are a good number that are faster. Still, it's quite the handheld shredder at close to medium range. As a carbine and a bullpup, the MTAR-21 has some of the best on-the-move and hipfire accuracy in the game. You can make this better through attachments, but at CQB ranges, this weapon is fairly solid in the moving battle without any additional help. Those are the high points for this weapon, and the MTAR gets pretty far on those features alone. It's a rather deadly weapon in bursts, but has a lot of trouble in sustained firefights with multiple converging opponents. So let's look at the not so good stuff. The MTAR-21 has the second worst first shot recoil among all the automatics. At a 2.6 multiplier, your first shot is going to send your aim moving pretty wildly from the get-go, and then it gets worse. Combine that with the 0.42 left-right deviation and this gun starts to get out of control pretty fast at 900 rounds per minute. The MTAR has some of the worst side-to-side recoil in the game. The more rounds that escape the MTAR, which happens very quickly, the more of a mess the end result becomes. Now, if the side-to-side wasn't enough to scare you, the MTAR also has some woeful spread per shot increase at 0.117 degrees per round. This isn't quite as bad as the Bulldog or FAMAS, but it does make pulling off mid-range and long-range shots a bit more difficult than is useful. Because this weapon fires so fast, this penalty to spread builds up very quickly. Additionally, the weapon recovers very slowly, so sustained firefights become woefully inaccurate. Finally, while I don't think this would be a huge problem on other weapons, the 2.35 second bullet in chamber and 2.75 second empty reload times of the MTAR are a problem for a specific reason. Because of its accuracy issues combined with its high rate of fire, carbine damage model, and CQB-centric nature, you'll find yourself almost constantly reloading this weapon. This can be managed, but this is a major detraction for this weapon. I'll talk more about the strategies for mitigating some of these negative points in a moment, but I want to talk about my overall experience with the weapon first. I found that the MTAR basically became this weapon where I would win one-on-one battles frequently, but it just couldn't hold its own the higher the tempo the action got. The MTAR is beautiful for dispatching one enemy at a time, but add another enemy and it starts to get a little bit dicey, and 3 enemies was a huge rarity for this weapon. And looking at some of the scores per minute of the top MTAR-21 users on BF4stats.com, this makes sense. They mostly seem to be safe players, because the MTAR-21 is not made well for prolonged engagements. So let's talk about how you control this monstrosity. You're going to find that this weapon will pretty much fight you in every engagement, particularly if you go with certain attachments over others. When naked, the MTAR-21 has a 0.3 vertical recoil and a 0.42 left and a 0.42 right. With 900 rounds per minute rate of fire, this means that the weapon is going to pull up and randomly spray left and right as it rises, generally filling out in a cone-like pattern. To counter this, you'll need to pull straight down against the weapon. I find that firing the weapon in burst counteracts some of the spread, but again, the decrease is not super fast. You'll have to end up really working for mid and long range shots with this weapon. It's going to take between 5 and 7 rounds to the chest to kill your target, and given the likely spread, this is going to be quite a few bullets at range. Patience is key. Tactics are one of the facts about the weapon I had to learn through pain. The MTAR-21 is a son of a gun that tries to be your friend but secretly undermines you in every battle. Particularly, you'll find yourself reloading nearly constantly because of the fast rounds per minute and high reload times. There's a couple of ways to deal with the long reloads. Firstly, whenever you're reloading, be sure to have your finger on speed dial for your secondary. The moment an enemy appears near you during a reload, you need to either be drawing your secondary or making a break for cover if they're further away. Second, to deal with the reload times, you'll need to be very conservative with this weapon's approach to battles. You're generally okay to take on 1 to 2 enemies at a time. However, that third enemy will kill you nearly every time when you run dry. What I ended up doing when I was successful with the MTAR was picking off an enemy or two, getting to safe cover, reloading, and not re-emerging until I was ready to go again. Rushing while reloading will get you killed pretty often with the MTAR-21. Not properly escaping to a safe place will also get you killed. In fact, you should be prepared to die reloading at least once per match with the MTAR, but it's not without its benefits. The MTAR is a reliable close to medium range shredder. If you pull the trigger first in a face-to-face engagement, chances are your enemy is going to die first, unless they have a shotgun. What you do in regards to tactical use of the weapon outside of reloads is going to depend on your attachments. So let's talk about those now. Attachments are where the MTAR gets a little interesting. In general, I found that there were a number of attachment setups that work to varying degrees for the MTAR-21. Looking at BF4stats.com and cross-referencing that with Battlelog, the most popular attachment combinations appeared to be the red dot sight, target detector, stubby grip, and heavy barrel. The second most popular was the red dot sight, target detector, vertical grip, and compensator. At face value, they both have their merits, but what setup did I ultimately prefer? For the optic, I went with the reflex red dot sight. In particular, I think that this sight is a nice cross between a CQB sight and a medium range sight. The MTAR, while not the most amazing medium range weapon, is still quite serviceable even out to 35 meters. You may prefer the Coyote or Cobra, and I think both are valid, but the reflex was really my preference for this weapon. On the accessory, it's definitely the target detector all the way. Because I started playing a bit more guarded with this weapon, I found myself scanning for targets quite a bit more frequently than I usually do, and I think something like the laser sight would give me away at a range that would really not be very favorable. If you don't have final stand or the target detector, you could certainly go with the laser sight if you're disciplined enough to keep it turned off outside CQB. Now the next two attachments have a variety of options that will change how you play with this weapon. First, I'm going to talk about my two favorites and how they modify the way the MTAR plays. My first and preferred combination starts with a heavy barrel. This really helps to dial in the accuracy to give the MTAR-21 power at mid-range. Because it's a carbine, the MTAR starts to eclipse some of the PDWs at these ranges, and the heavy barrel makes it a bit more versatile. However, this comes at a big cost, not mitigating that left-right deviation and making the upwards kick quite a bit more difficult to manage. In fact, this might not be a viable option if you have trouble controlling upwards recoil. The second part of the first combination is the stubby grip. I find that the stubby grip is a nice natural complement to the heavy barrel, especially on higher rate of fire weapons, and particularly on the MTAR because the spread per shot increase is so strong. Again, in combination with the heavy barrel, this helps to keep your accuracy under control, particularly in more drawn-out firefights, which the MTAR is particularly weak at. So in review, my first combination is heavy barrel and stubby grip. The second combination is also worth considering. It starts with the compensator. Because of the left-right deviation on this weapon, shots can become unpredictable fairly quickly. The compensator helps to deflate the left-right by about 25%. However, it increases the spread per shot, which is already pretty bad on the MTAR-21, so you get a little bit more predictability on the initial shots for a major penalty in longer fights. It also makes mid and long-range kills much harder to achieve. If you really only care about killing somewhat closer and can cover your recovery and reloads pretty well, this might be a better setup for you. To go with that compensator, you could also use a vertical grip. This will give you somewhat better on-the-move ability and hipfire. Particularly if you're good at switching your hipfire and aim-fire game, this might be the attachment to consider. So my second favorite combo is the compensator and vertical grip. I did try two other setups that weren't very successful. The first of which was the angle grip with no barrel and micro-bursting. While this gave me better initial accuracy, the long range and sustained power was significantly lacking. It also was a major burden skill-wise during fights that didn't give much more benefit than the compensator vertical grip combo. I also tried using a silencer, but I found it to be a somewhat less than useful setup. You don't get much benefit other than hiding yourself from the minimap, and it makes you nearly useless at any kind of range. The MTAR-21 is an okay weapon, but I still wouldn't recommend it to most people because there are many options that are better in every class. It's a gun that's okay, but not great, and doesn't really do much to carve itself a niche that makes it worth the serious detractions in accuracy and reload times that it brings. If you can overcome these shortcomings, or you're a slow and methodical player, you might find the MTAR-21 to be your little slice of heaven. But I think there are better options. So what would I go with over the MTAR? Well, if you're assault, you should definitely consider using the AK-971, which is nearly identical but at the same time better in almost every way except moving fire and hip fire. As an engineer or aggressive recon, I'd go with the carbine that is slightly slower, the ACWR. I find the ACWR to be far more reliable and controllable than the MTAR. And finally, if you're playing support or just want a CQB weapon in general, any shotgun would do, but I prefer the DBV-12. That's it for this episode of Yes or No. If there's something you think I missed, or if you have a different take on the MTAR-21, please let me know. If there's a particular weapon you'd like to see reviewed on this series, leave a comment below indicating which weapon. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time, YouTube.